It's an issue that is once again defining a presidential election: immigration. It's time to wake up, Washington, because poll after poll shows immigration is a top priority among Americans. And while it's dropped below the economy, according to a recent Emerson College poll, it remains in the top 5 issues for voters. Last week, President Biden moved on this issue without Congress.
Republicans have left me no choice. Today, I'm announcing actions to bar migrants who cross our southern border unlawfully from receiving asylum.
The president's executive action would allow most asylum seekers to be turned away after the 7-day average reaches more than 2,500 people between ports of entry. That threshold has already been met. It comes after the Senate tried and failed twice to pass a bipartisan bill that included similar restrictions. Those votes failed in large part due to influence from former President Trump. But a new CBS News YouGov poll shows a whopping 70% of voters approve of the action, and that might have implications come November. Producer Georgina Miro hit the streets to talk to voters about their biggest concerns about immigration.
How much of an issue is immigration for you?
Very frustrating. I'm an immigrant, but I want things to do in order.
Immigration should occur. I think that we were made on immigration.
There's a policy and plan for people to get into this country in a very fair way. There's also an illegal way to come in.
It's not something that can be solved quickly. It's been going on for every president.
It's not fair to the people that have waited in line for years and have an American dream of coming here and working and contributing to society, that now all of a sudden there's people that are hopping the border.
They want to come over, let them come over.
Joining us now from KVEO South Texas Correspondent for Nexstar Media's Border Report, Sandra Sanchez. Sandra, thank you so much for joining us here today. You're based on the border in McAllen, Texas. What has been happening on the ground since the executive action took effect? Have we seen any migrant crossings slowing at all?
Well, thanks for having me. Here in South Texas in the Rio Grande Valley, our numbers are relatively low. Most of the migrants are crossing farther west, the Nogales, Arizona sector, San Diego sector, as you know. Here we have about 200 crossings per day, and that's stayed about relatively stable. I have been on the border. I've filmed and seen the apprehension of some women and children. Migrants are still coming across. But I did speak to a pastor, Abraham Berberi, who runs a church in Matamoros, Mexico, which is just across the border from Brownsville. And he says that they are advising migrants there to not cross the river in irregular locations, to wait until they have their CBP-1 asylum appointment and cross at legal ports of entry. Part of that is because, as you know, if a migrant is encountered and they crossed irregularly and they are sent back, it could be 5 years before they could try again, before they could be allowed to try again to claim asylum under this new executive order. So migrant advocates are highly encouraging them to not do that. And he says, for the most part, most are listening to them. There's a camp by the river, and it used to have, in December, there were 500, 700 people there. He says there's 45 to 50 people now. The numbers have really dwindled. There are about 500 people waiting at a renovated hospital about 10 minutes inland. But they all have CBP-1 asylum appointments, and so they're just staying there. He says the other big trend that's happening is that migrants are not coming to the border and waiting in border towns. Instead, they're going to major cities in Mexico like Monterrey, which is about 100 miles southwest. They're getting jobs, they're supporting themselves, and they're waiting for their CBP-1 appointment, and then they're coming to the border. So we're seeing a kind of a different dynamic happening here right now.
Yeah, the difference in those dynamics happening in border towns, across the U.S. southern border is interesting and definitely worth pointing out. Here in Washington, we've seen the reaction from Republican and Democratic officials on Capitol Hill. But I'm curious, how are Republican and Democratic lawmakers and officials in Texas reacting to this executive action?
Right. President Biden wasn't very popular with this announcement. Congressman Vicente Gonzalez, a Democrat who represents represents Cameron County, which is the Gulf Coast, he was actually at the White House for the announcement. And, he supports the president's action, but he did say he wished he would have done it before. Congressman Henry Cuellar, a Democrat who represents Starr County and Laredo, told me last week that he's been telling the Biden administration for 3 years that something like this needs to be implemented. The Hidalgo County Judge Richard Cortez says we need law and order, we need border security, and we need more happening here to help border communities which are taking the brunt. On the Republican side, Monica de la Cruz, Congresswoman who represents McAllen, she today pointed out that 8 men who were on a terror watch list from Tajikistan actually entered the border. And she says this just exemplifies the fact that we need tougher border security. As you know, Senators Cruz and Cornyn also panned the order. So, you know, he is taking a lot of criticism. I will say that Congressman Gonzalez and Cuellar have often said that what we need are ways to minimize the push and pull factors further south that drive people north.
So Sandra, in addition to the recent executive action, the Biden administration is cracking down on human trafficking across the Darien Gap between South and Central America. Walk us through what's being done there and what it really means for the people who ultimately cross that gap.
Right. It's called Joint Task Force Alpha, and it's an operation by the State Department, Department of Homeland Security, and the Justice Department. It's been in existence for 3 years, and now they are expanding it to include Colombia and Panama. And that is the Darien Gap, the 60 miles of jungle, as you know, that migrants are being trafficked. And they're really targeting the leaders of the Clan de Golfo, which is a Colombian cartel organization that is primarily responsible for trafficking people across. They're even offering $8 million in rewards for information that could lead to the dismantling of the cartel or their financial operations. And so they said that, you know, this is the 3rd anniversary of this task force. They've been operating in Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, and El Salvador. And now it's time to expand to this other area, which, as we mentioned, you know, is a real push-pull factor for bringing people north to the border. And migrant advocates, lawmakers have long been saying we have to close down the Darien Gap.
Sandra Sanchez joining us from McAllen, Texas. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Here with a look at the bigger picture of immigration is the Hill staff writer and immigration expert, Rafael Bernal. Rafael, I think you and I don't get to chat a lot on this show, so very good to see you here. I want to jump right into it with this executive action from President Biden. How different is it, and how different is the plan for the border from what former President Trump was originally trying to do?
It's always great to be here, and yeah, that is a great question. At their core, this order, this entire initiative is very similar to what Trump wanted to do. They basically both try to deter future migrants from coming by making asylum harder and sort of raising the bar. And when migrants don't make that bar, they expel people to Mexico, or they detain them, or they deport them quicker. It's putting a lot of resources on bouncing people out quickly, rather than the idea of just processing more asylum claims. So they're very similar. They're sort of framed in a very different way. Let's remember, you know, former President Trump framed a lot of his asylum ban in language connected to his so-called Muslim ban, and that, you know, kind of language that you would never see from a Democratic administration.
So on that note of bouncing people out, we know that Biden's executive action calls for border suspension of entry after migrant encounters exceed the threshold. Rafael, is it possible to even shut down the border, and could it happen in reality?
Yeah, so Biden started using that phrase, shutting down the border. He was going to shut down the border. It's kind of politically, it sounds great if you're trying to look tough on the border. But I've noticed White House and DHS officials are kind of backtracking on that one, because no, it's not possible to shut down the border. The idea of shutting down the border makes one think of closing trade with Mexico, closing ports of entry. So obviously that's impossible. That would be economically disastrous, probably. When it's been attempted in the past, it hasn't really worked. He can shut down or greatly decrease asylum processing for people coming in between ports of entry. But even then, it's pretty hard to fully shut down asylum. So I suspect we'll see less of that shutdown language going forward.
You know, was this move by Biden, who has been hammered on the border by Republicans and even has gotten some pressure from, some Democrats, particularly Democrats in border districts and border states, was this a political move by the White House? Was Biden thinking sort of in the same way as Trump was, saying, I need to figure out how a move on the border will impact my own presidential chances?
I mean, it's entirely political, and especially when you factor in, and it was entirely political when Trump did it. And Trump's rhetoric has been entirely political in the sense that if you track immigration and especially border crossings over the last 25 years, you'll find, and there's studies here, that immigration really responds more to economic indicators than to absolutely anything, any policy that the US government puts in place at the border. And that's a discussion that people have within the administration. It's been going on for decades within DHS. There are people on both sides of that question, whether US border policy makes any difference or whether it's just the economic imbalance between the United States and Latin America that's going to determine numbers. But it is political, and there's a little bit of a glimmer of hope for the Biden administration that it might be working. The early polls I've seen relatively high support, in some cases very high support, from voters for this measure. I would also contend, and I'm pretty certain, 99% of voters don't actually know what's in the package because it's technical, it's complicated. Not everybody can be expected to really dive into the weeds on immigration and border policy. So yes, it is political, but the entire conversation around immigration is political. And I think that's what the White House is just, that's the environment it's acting within.
Yeah, so those of us, north of the border are looking at this politically, but obviously in Mexico, politicians and lawmakers are also looking at this situation. And there's been some major movement in terms of Mexico's politics. Major players are changing this year. You just did an in-depth look at Mexico's new president. I want to take a look at that.
Mexican President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum has drawn massive media attention as the first woman and the first Jewish person elected to the top office. But when she takes office on October 1st, she is going to have to hit the ground running. One of her top challenges will be dealing with the United States and with the one issue that's engulfed U.S. politics: migration. Sheinbaum won the election on June 2nd in a massive landslide, promising to keep President Andrés Manuel López Obrador's policies. López Obrador has essentially become the continent's top migration cop. He's been cutting deals with both the Biden and Trump administration to limit how many migrants move north and to take some third country nationals back when they're expelled from the United States. So similarities aside, López Obrador spent his first 2 years fielding Trump's threats and the next 4 years talking it out with Biden. In a nutshell, Trump threatened López Obrador to cooperate or else. Biden, he used more orthodox diplomatic means. Now, we'll never know if Trump would have followed up on his threats. The pandemic came and migration basically froze. Sheinbaum has said she wants the United States to invest serious money in development programs in Mexico South and throughout Central America. She wants to take the jobs to would-be migrants and not the other way around. That pitch might fly with the second Biden administration. But if Trump is elected again, Sheinbaum will almost certainly have to change her tune. But in the broader US-Mexico relationship, migration is just the tip of the iceberg. For starters, the two countries have the single biggest bilateral trade relationship on Earth. In 2023, the two countries traded just under $800 billion. It's still short of the $817 billion of commerce between the United States and China in 2018, but US-China trade has since dropped under $600 billion. US-Mexico trade numbers are expected to keep going up as companies keep focus on nearshoring. That's setting up shop in Mexico instead of Asia. That sounds like great news for Sheinbaum. But there are a series of bubbling trade disputes, many of them a direct consequence of López Obrador policies that promise to strain relations between the two countries. And global financial markets, they aren't thrilled at her win either. Sheinbaum's landslide was huge. She basically beat the opposition candidate by a 2-to-1 ratio. López Obrador's political party, Morena, also won big, and it might even get a constitutional supermajority. And that's what markets don't like. López Obrador wants to pass a series of constitutional reforms to weaken the judiciary before he steps down. And that makes investors jittery. Since Sheinbaum's election, the peso has dropped from 17 per dollar to 18.40 per dollar. That'll make Mexican imports cheaper in the United States, but it'll make US-made goods more expensive for Mexican families. That could drive more migration, as it has in the past. Financial concerns aside, Sheinbaum will also have to juggle bilateral cooperation on organized crime, including human, drug, and arms trafficking. How she juggles everything from October 1st onward will almost certainly have an effect on the US election in November. And the results of that election will determine if she needs to prepare for Trump or for Biden.
So, Rafael, it looks like it's going to be a very interesting year on both sides of the border.
It is, and right now, although Mexico is looking inwards for its politics, and that this reform, judiciary reform, is the big deal down there. The big question for Claudia Sheinbaum is going to be: is she going to have to deal with Trump, or is she going to have to deal with Biden? The issues might be the same, but the style is going to be hugely different.
Yeah, I guarantee you she's preparing for both cases, both scenarios right now as she gets situated in her new role. Rafael Bernal, thank you so much for joining us, and let's do this again soon.
Hey, always happy to come on.
Less than 6 months out from Election Day, polls are continuing to tighten as the presidential race heats up. Former President Trump is continuing his run as a convicted felon, campaigning in Las Vegas and making a much-needed push in Nevada.
For 3.5 years, the people of Nevada have had a front row seat to Joe Biden's evil and criminal obliteration of our southern border. It was criminal what he's done.
And over in the Biden campaign, the president continues to seize onto comments made by Trump and his conviction, with hopes of convincing voters that the former president is not fit to be commander-in-chief again. But will that strategy work? Or will Biden need to move forward and focus on showing voters why he should be the one elected this November? Here to go on the record is Director of Data Science from Decision Desk HQ, Scott Tranter. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Let's jump right into it. The election will come down to a handful of states, many of which Biden won in 2020. I want to take a closer look at Nevada following Trump's campaign stop there over the weekend. What are the latest numbers from Decision Desk's new forecasting tool in predicting the presidential outcome in Nevada?
So right now we have a slight advantage for Donald Trump in Nevada. And I can see that one going back and forth quite a bit over the next couple of months. That's a battleground state, both at the Senate and the presidential level. We see Donald Trump making inroads with Hispanic voters, which, you know, if he continues to do that, it's going to make Nevada very competitive. Also, you know, we saw his speech this weekend. He's doing what politicians do. When he came out and said, look, I'm going to make tipped wage workers tips, you know, tax free. That's a direct appeal to the wage workers and the tip workers in Nevada, which there are a lot of them. You know, so he's certainly making a play for that one there, and I expect that one to be close all the way to the end. Yeah, big hospitality industry, obviously, in the greater Las Vegas area. So I want to come back east to Pennsylvania, which Biden won in 2020. Decision Desk has Trump leading in that state now. What are the former president's chances of flipping Pennsylvania back to red as of this week? Look, it's pretty strong. He's in the low 50s there, and that is a state. Look, Biden likes to say he's the second son of Pennsylvania. In terms of where he's from, it's going to be a tough one simply because the dynamics and fundamentals of where Pennsylvania is. It's a state that really is reactive. The voters are really reactive to the economy, which we know has been the number one issue. It's got, especially Western Pennsylvania, it's got a lot of those non-college educated voters that Trump does extremely well with. And Donald Trump is making some inroads in the African American vote, which will make him not necessarily competitive in Philadelphia, but will chip away at some votes that Joe Biden's going to need in the fall. All that being said, Pennsylvania has historically been a Democratic state in some of these close contests. We saw this in 2020, so I don't expect Joe Biden to give it up easily. But right now, Donald Trump's got an edge, and he's got a little bit of momentum there.
Yeah, and Donald Trump has won Pennsylvania before, shocked a lot of people when he flipped it in 2016. So he certainly has a history there. Want to go to Wisconsin, which Donald Trump also won in 2016, but lost in 2020. What are we seeing in that state? What's the state of play?
Very similar to Pennsylvania. I would say that one is probably a little bit more competitive and maybe a little bit more momentum for Joe Biden. And that's just because of where we see some of the Senate race coming. Obviously, Donald Trump's winning there, but I think we're going to see some polling come out and some fundraising that's gonna get Biden a little bit more competitive there. And again, that's in contrast to Pennsylvania. What I will say is this: historically, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, they vote as a block. We haven't seen them split, go, 2 for one candidate and 1 for the other, or vice versa, in, at least 4 or 5 election cycles, if not more. And so I look at this as Wisconsin getting competitive. Where we are in Pennsylvania, we may talk about in Michigan in a minute. These are all going to vote as a block.
Georgia was definitely the state to watch in 2020 when Biden flipped it and Democrats at the Senate level also flipped it. But it's looking a lot tougher for the president this year. So in the case that Biden were to lose Georgia and Trump were to flip it back to red, what states would Biden need to win in order to, still win the election?
So we talked about 2 of them already: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. The other one is Michigan. He wins those 3. He's pretty much going to eke at about 270, maybe a little bit more electoral votes, even if he loses Nevada and Arizona. Nevada and Arizona, as we've talked about, very close. A lot of momentum for Trump out there. Still a lot of time to go. But I think, you bring up a good point about Georgia. It's a state that Joe Biden won last time, but he won very, very closely. And fundamentally, Georgia is a Republican state. I know we've been talking about it as a battleground state at the Senate and the presidential level for a couple cycles now. But that one is, solidly in Donald Trump's column at the moment. It'll be competitive. Both sides will spend money, but he's going to be favored to win there this fall.
So we've been watching the polls closely after Trump's conviction, and we aren't seeing much of an impact as of yet. But a new CBS YouGov poll shows 28% of likely voters saying Trump's conviction will factor into their vote in November. Could we not see the impact of Trump's conviction until Election Day a few months from now?
Certainly, but by that, I think we'll be talking about, hey, was there some other campaign event, a debate or a fundraising or a gaffe or something affecting it? What I found interesting about that stat you put up there in that CBS poll is, while 28% said they did, at the end of the day, the top line didn't move a whole lot. So, and again, voters can take time to discuss and figure out what really impacts them. They still may be figuring out the verdict and what it means for them. But I think my big takeaway post verdict is the polls really haven't moved a whole lot. Despite voters saying it's factoring into them. It's kind of like saying, look, I'm gonna go on a diet tomorrow, but they still haven't changed their ways yet.
So when looking at this case, I think, the biggest divide, and we see this very clearly in the top lines, is how Democrats and Republicans approach this and view the prosecution. 80% of Republicans believe Trump was charged at the direction of the Biden administration. There's no evidence to suggest that at all. But how much of an impact could these unproven theories have on Biden's 2024 chances?
I think it could have a pretty big impact. And I think we're seeing that in terms of Biden's favorability and the fact that the incumbent president is behind in a couple of these states now. Because you showed Democrats and Republicans there, but there are a healthy chunk of independents who also think the same. Not a majority, but depending on the poll, 20 or 30% of independents think that the legal stuff is the prosecution is politically motivated. That's detrimental. As you pointed out, there's no evidence to point that out, but perception's reality for a lot of voters, and they're remembering that as they pick their candidate.
I want to stick with that same CBS YouGov poll that also shows an increase in voters supporting Biden. Their reasoning is to oppose Trump. So could we see Biden win the election for the sole reason that voters just don't want Trump elected to a second term? You know, I think back to 2016, and it seemed like a lot of Hillary Clinton's message was, elect me, I'm not him. And we know how that turned out for her.
Yeah, I'd look at that more as not necessarily a voters, expanding Joe Biden's voter base because of that, but more strengthening the voters he does have. It's going to motivate him. Joe Biden needs to raise money. He needs to, garner enthusiasm and momentum. We talked about a little bit about where I see the momentum in Pennsylvania, and it looks like on Trump's side, same in Nevada. Joe Biden's got a few months left in the campaign. He's going to have to recapture that. And I think motivated voters like that, and that is a motivating factor, will be good. But as you pointed out, you've got to offer voters an alternative, not just a, hey, I'm better than that guy.
Scott Tranter, thank you so much for joining us as always.
Thanks for having me.
That's it for What's America Thinking. I'm Julia Manchester. Come back next week. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel.